with Superman kicking off the DCU and Fantastic Four First Steps kind of setting a restart moment for the MCU, I'm thinking a lot about how these universes, these franchises kind of reboot themselves, reinvent themselves. And recently I was writing about the absolute comic book universe in the DC Comics. So obviously I write for TV and film, I write for Screen Rant, and write about all these different topics and discussions. But we recently were discussing something about the absolute comic books and how they could inspire, tie in, provide ideas for what is to come in the DCU. And while I've heard a little bit about the DCU, about the absolute comic book run, and I've heard a little bit about like absolute Batman and seeing the pictures with like this big bulky dude and the big square kind of bat symbol, I didn't have a great understanding of what it was. And so today I started doing a big deep dive on it, and it sounds wild. It's crazy. One of my biggest things that has ever put me off reading comics, I've read a couple of different runs of comic books. I've purchased different sets that kind of go through, you know, limited runs or issues or stories or whatever. I've enjoyed them, but I've always struggled because I like a complete story. I like to start at the start and go all the way through. So when the MCU came out, and it was in 2008, and I was old enough to be able to watch it, and it was something that kind of like caught me from the very beginning, that was incredible. And that was something that was wonderful for me to be able to engage with and progressively go as it kind of has grown bigger and bigger. I've followed along every step of the way. So that for me worked beautifully. That was an incredible thing for me to have and experience. But comic books started, you know, as early as like 1938 for DC Comics, and Superman's comics, specifically Action Comics. Then they've had like the 1960s, they had Fantastic Four, they had Spider-Man, they had Hulk, they had all these different characters come out at all these different times. And while the stories are not just one continual run, you get a lot more from it by knowing the end and the beginning and doing that. So for me, I've struggled to connect with it. But the absolute DC universe ties into the comics in such a different way. So as far as I understand it, it's not a reboot. It's not trying to reinvent these characters in a typical fashion where they've kind of like done the wiping the universes and then kind of starting over and DC Reborn and all these different things. This is a total reimagining of familiar characters. So they started out with kind of the big three. They have Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. And then they've also got a couple of other comic books in that lineup that have started to kind of come in. So Martian Manhunter, Flash, I think another one, I can't remember what one that was. But they've started to kind of develop these comics, these ideas, and these characters. And while they're a little bit familiar, you recognize who they are, and maybe their costumes to some degree, their logos, and there's familiar context clues and points in there. This is not your average version of Batman. It's not your average version of Superman. These are completely new versions of the character. So they still have the names, you know, Bruce, Wayne, Clark Kent, whatever. But like, as far as absolute Batman goes, he's not an orphan. Just think about that for a second. Like, that's an integral part of this story when you're talking about Batman. He's not an orphan. He had his parents raising him. And then in addition to that, he's not wealthy. He's not a billionaire who is at the top of the food chain in Gotham. So already the kind of like points that are laying a foundation for the story are so different. These are underdog heroes. These are people who come from a completely different background, a completely different atmosphere, and their story is completely reimagined, reinvented in this new and exciting way. Frankly, I mean, these like I said a second ago, these characters are characters that have been around in comic books for decades, like way longer than most of us, most of our parents, and some of even our grandparents have ever been around. These comic book characters have literally been all over the place. They've done so many things, had so many adventures, had so many things done to them, all sorts of stories told. And at some points, it can start to feel a little bit repetitive or a little bit stale. And I don't know if that's how everyone feels, but certainly for me, I kind of understand that as being a kind of criticism towards these things where everything's happened. So what's new? What can you do with it that is fresh and exciting? But for the DC Absolute Universe specifically, seeing them be so creative and so free in the way that they're able to approach these characters is really exciting. It's really invigorating to see these characters that are beloved and frankly have like a monopoly on the space taken and put into a new situation. So I've often in the past kind of talked about how I struggle a little bit with Marvel and DC as being things that everyone is already familiar with, and they have so much context, and they have to be very precious about their characters. They can't play with them, they can't be too loose, they can't be too crazy, because these characters have a long backlog of lore and they have to exist in those confines. For me, while that means they have like a lot of richness, there's a lot of depth, there's a lot of understanding about who these people are, it also invites a lot of contention and frustration for people who are trying to break in. Whether you're a reader or a writer, somebody that's trying to actually break in and write these characters and come up with ways to make a mark in their story. It can be difficult because there's such a vast amount of material that's already there. But for these characters to be reimagined in such an intense way that they are almost new is very exciting. Because when you think about a character like Superman, right? Superman is the first superhero. And as the first superhero, he kind of just got a hold of all the powers, you know, his super strength, super speed, flying, laser vision, ice breath, all these different things. Superman has it. He has it all. And so it starts to kind of like wane, and you have to figure out, how do we make this story interesting? What do we do with it? And we've seen an exciting way that that's been approached in terms of the DCU, because they've reimagined this character again. They've put him on the big screen in a way that feels fresh and different, in a way that hasn't been done in a long time. But for the comic books, to have this character of Superman who now was raised partially on Krypton, so he was not sent off as a baby, but part of his youth he was raised on Krypton, that introduces new complexities. There are new things about that change the foundation of his story. His planet wasn't this thing that was just blown up as a baby before he ever had experience there. He is a Kryptonian, and he has memories of being a Kryptonian and an understanding of that. So that's interesting, you know? I think it's great that they're approaching these characters with fresh eyes. I think it's great that they're trying something different, especially now when the kind of like people are talking about superhero fatigue in terms of the big screen and what is happening in that kind of medium. I think it's wonderful to be able to go back to these stories with a fresh perspective and to get a whole new understanding of them. So I am really, really keen to go and read the entire catalog of the Absolute DC universe, because while I might be a bit of a Marvel fanboy for a lot of things, I do agree that DC has spectacular characters. And the stories that they have and the stories they tell in the DC comics specifically are brilliant. They're incredible. The lore behind it is awesome. But to see them go back to foundations and to make everything new and fresh is very, very exciting, very compelling to me. So I'm really interested in going and seeing the DCU Absolute Universe, the DC Absolute Universe in comics. Sorry. But yeah, I'm kind of wondering, what about you guys? Have you ever picked up comic books? Do you have some of the same gripes? Are you experiencing, have you read it already? Have you read into the DC Absolute Universe? And is it something that you're interested in? Do you recommend it? I want to know all that and more. If you let me know in the comments, or if you subscribe, follow along, and we can kind of take this journey on together, that'd be awesome. I talk about TV, movies, comics, and everything that interests me on these kinds of spaces. So please like, follow, and keep coming back for more. Thank you.